The alarm had been screaming for 40 seconds before I silenced it, not because the situation was under control. Nothing was under control. I silenced it because I needed to think, and I could not think with that sound tearing through my skull. 41 people were looking at me from their stations. Some of them were barely 20 years old. None of them spoke. They were waiting for me to say something that would make this survivable. I was Commander Arvas, and I had absolutely nothing to say. Through the forward glass of the ESV unbroken, I could see them. 340 ships, CAF Dominion warships, arranged in a wide arc that stretched from one edge of the viewport to the other, catching the pale light of our sun like a wall of dark metal. They were perfectly still. They were not hurrying. They had no reason to hurry. We had every reason to hurry and nowhere to go. The Unbroken was 62 years old. She had started her life as a deep space deterrence vessel, classified, expensive, and then quietly forgotten when the political landscape shifted and her weapons were deemed too extreme to ever use. She had been patched, repurposed, patch again, stripped of most of her original systems by people who did not know what those systems were for, and finally designated for decommissioning. She was sitting in Lunar Dock 7, half her hull plates removed when the Keth hit the series engagement and wiped out every other human warship in a single afternoon. That was 3 years ago. Since then she had been crewed by whoever was left, repaired with whatever could be found, and kept flying on stubbornness and bad decisions. She was the last human warship in existence. She looked like it. I pulled up the external feed on my console and watched the Keth fleet hold its position. They had arrived 6 hours ago, slipping out of their fold transit points in a spread that covered the outer solar system like a net. Their approach to Earth had been slow and deliberate. They wanted us to watch. They wanted us to understand what was coming before it arrived. Behind me, Ensign Owen Garrett cleared his throat. He was 22, originally a systems technician, currently functioning as my communications officer because the actual communications officer had been one of the 14 people we lost when a coolant line ruptured on the way back from Titan. Owen was good at his job. He was also clearly terrified, which I respected because it meant he understood the situation accurately. Commander, he said quietly, I'm reading an incoming transmission, wideband open channel. It's addressed to any human military vessel still in operation. I let out a slow breath, put it through. The voice that filled the bridge was translated by our system into flat, precise English. The KTH did not bother learning human languages. They had machines for that, and machines were beneath their dignity to acknowledge. This is Supreme Admiral Voro of the Keth Dominion 3rd Expansion Fleet. I am transmitting this message on all available frequencies as a courtesy to any surviving human military presence. You are invited to observe the final resolution of the human territorial question. Your solar system will be formally incorporated into the Dominion within the next 48 hours. No resistance is expected. If any human vessel remains operational, it is encouraged to present itself. This will be taken as evidence of civilized conduct and may positively influence the terms of integration. The bridge was silent for a moment after the transmission ended. Navigator Priya Akefer, who had been with the Unbroken longer than anyone except me, turned slowly in her chair and looked at me. with an expression I could not quite name. It was not fear, it was something older than fear, something that had been sitting behind her eyes for 3 years, waiting to either be justified or proven wrong. Positively influenced the terms of integration, she said. I heard it. He said no resistance is expected. I heard that too. The galactic relay beacon on our communications array was lighting up. Other alien powers were tuned in. The Sarathi Assembly, the Mech Confederacy, the Pale Syndicate, all of them watching the feed from the KAT fleet-owned broadcast drones. Whatever happened next would be witnessed by roughly 400 inhabited systems across the known galaxy. The KTH had made sure of that. They wanted an audience for the end of humanity's independence. They wanted it on record. I understood the psychology. It was a message to everyone watching, not just to us. It said, this is what happens. This is how it goes. Do not waste your time. I sat in the command chair and looked at my crew, 41 people, engineers, technicians, a medic named Callum Hart, who had originally shipped out as a biology researcher and had spent 3 years performing field surgery with no formal training. Weapons officer named Diana Ford, who knew the Unbroken's gun systems better than anyone alive, but had openly told me twice that she did not think those systems would matter. A chief engineer named Patrick Lyle, who spoke to the ship's reactor the way other people spoke to pets, with patient affection and zero confidence that it would listen. These were the people who were going to watch me decide what humanity did next. I keyed the transmitter. Supreme Admiral Voro, I said, this is Commander Aller Voss of the Earth Survey Vessel Unbroken. We copy your transmission. We are standing by. There was a pause from the K fleet. Then, slowly, something remarkable happened. The alien commentary on the relay network began to filter through. Owen was monitoring it, and I could see from his expression that it was not complimentary. A Sarathi diplomat, speaking to what she clearly believed was a private channel that was in fact still partially open, described the Unbroken as a remarkable artifact of a species that outlasted its moment. Mech analyst ran what he called a combat probability index on our vessel and announced a result he found so amusing that he shared it with 3 colleagues. Before the channel closed, a pale syndicate observer simply said in the clipped shorthand of their language, "1 ship old pattern, no factor, no factor." I read the phrase on Owen's screen and something settled in my chest. Not anger, not despair, something quieter and more durable than either. I had been a naval officer for 23 years. I had served on 7 vessels before the Unbroken. I had watched Earth's military shrink from a genuine space power to this 1 ship old pattern, not because we were weak, but because the galaxy had moved faster than our politics, our budgets, our ability to adapt. We had been slow. We had been proud when we should have been cautious, and cautious when we should have been moving. The series engagement had not been a military defeat as much as a revelation. We had arrived to a fight we did not understand, with tools we had not maintained, against an enemy who had studied us for years, while we congratulated ourselves on making it this far. But the Unbroken was still here, and there were things about the Unbroken that nobody, not the Keth, not the watching galaxy, not most of my own crew knew about. I turned to Owen. "Get me a direct channel to the KE fleet Admiral Vorek personally, Owen. Hesitated. Commander, the relay is still broadcasting. Everything we say goes to every receiver in range. Good, I said. Make sure it does. He opened the channel. The connection tone sounded across the bridge. Admiral Vorek, I said, I'd like to discuss your terms. We'll need time to review them properly. I'm asking for a 12-hour window before any further movement from your fleet. The reply came in 40 seconds, which meant Varro had been expecting the call. Granted, 12 hours, Commander, we are not. Without courtesy, I cut the channel and immediately turned to Patrick Lyall. Chief, I need you to begin the startup sequence for all secondary systems. Full diagnostic sweep, including the sealed sections. Patrick's eyes went slightly wide. In the 3 years I had commanded the Unbroken, I had never asked him to touch the sealed sections. They were marked in the ship's registry as legacy ordnance storage. Nobody had the access codes, or so everyone had believed. I reached into the inner pocket of my uniform jacket and produced a small data card. It had been given to me by the previous Captain Commander Leonard Hale 3 years ago on the shuttle dock at Siri Station, 20 minutes before he boarded his ship and flew into the engagement that ended him. He had pressed it into my hand without explanation and said only, if it ever gets to one ship, Alara, use it. I had been carrying it ever since. Begin the sequence, I told Patrick. We have 12 hours and I want to know everything this ship is actually capable of before we run out of them. Patrick took the card. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at me, then nodded once and went to work. Outside the viewport, 340K warships waited with the patient confidence of a force that had never lost. They were watching us. Whole galaxy was watching us. I did not mind being watched. I had spent 3 years commanding a ship everyone had written off. I was used to being underestimated. What the galaxy did not understand, what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that the Unbroken had not survived 3 years on luck alone. She had survived because someone 60 years ago had built her for exactly this moment, and she was only now starting to wake up. The first thing Patrick said when he plugged the data card into the engineering console was nothing. He stood completely still for almost 30 seconds, reading whatever the card had unlocked on his screen. Then he picked up the internal comm and asked me in a voice that was trying very hard to stay professional if I could come down to the engineering bay at my earliest convenience. I told Owen to hold the bridge and took the ladder down 2 decks. The engineering bay of the Unbroken was a long, low room that smelled of recycled air and heat treated metal. Patrick was standing in front of the main diagnostic console with 3 other engineers crowded behind him, all of them staring at the same display. When I stepped in, he turned and looked at me with an expression I had only seen once before on a human face, on a junior analyst who had accidentally opened a classified file he was not supposed to see and realized too late that he could not unread it. Commander, Patrick said carefully, this ship is not what we thought it was. I know. No, he shook his head slowly. I mean that with great respect and a complete lack of exaggeration. This ship is not what any of us thought it was. The sealed sections alone account for 60% of the hull volume we thought was storage and structural ballast. There are 17 accelerator tracks running the length of the secondary hull. there is an energy emitter array under the dorsal plating. That has never been activated. The reactor has been running at 12% of rated capacity for the entire time I've been chief engineer, and I had no idea because the output curves were deliberately masked to look like a normal operating range. He paused. At full capacity, Commander, the power output of this reactor is not in any database I've ever consulted. I don't have a comparison point. The other engineers were very quiet. What else? I asked. He pulled up a secondary display, the sensor web for the past 6 hours while we've been sitting here. The ship has been passively releasing relay drones, tiny ones. I thought it was microparticle bleed from the hull. It wasn't. There are now approximately 400 of them distributed across a sphere roughly 15,000 km in radius. They worked together. They form a mapping system that, according to the documentation on this card, can resolve objects down to a few centimeters at combat range. He looked at me. We know exactly where every ship in that fleet is. We know their whole compositions, their propellant signatures, their relative distances from each other to within a meter. Behind him, his youngest engineer, a 24-year-old named Celia Marsh, who had joined the crew 8 months ago and had so far said very little that was not technically relevant, said quietly, "We've been mapping them since they arrived." "Yes," Patrick confirmed automatically. "The system runs without any human input. It's been collecting data since the moment the KE fleet appeared on our sensors." I let that settle for a moment. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "Can we use any of this? The accelerator tracks, the emitter array. Are they functional?" "The documentation says yes, but Commander." Patrick hesitated, and Patrick was not a man who hesitated often. He had kept a 60-year-old reactor running with components that were never designed to work together. Hesitation was not part of his vocabulary. The reason these systems were sealed was not because they were broken or incomplete. They were sealed because the people who built them decided they were too powerful to deploy without specific authorization. There are records in here of internal debates from the original design team. They were worried that if this ship ever used these systems in front of the wider galaxy, it would trigger a response that humanity could not manage. An arms race, I said, or worse, a preemptive move against us by anyone who felt threatened. I thought about the 340 ships outside. I thought about the galactic relay still broadcasting, the Sarai and the Mech and the Pale Syndicate all watching with comfortable disinterest. I thought about the word Vorak had used, integration. "Patrick," I said, "do you know what an arms race requires?" He waited. "To sides," I said, "get your team started." The next 9 hours were the most focused I had ever seen the engineering crew work. There was no panic, no argument, no wasted motion. Celia Marsh and her team began the careful process of bringing the accelerator tracks online, following startup procedures written 6 decades ago by people who had never expected them to actually be used. Each track had its own power management system, its own targeting feed from the drone network, its own independent firing mechanism, which meant that even if the ship took significant damage to one section, the others would continue to function. Whoever had designed the Unbroken had thought carefully about redundancy. The energy emitter array took longer. It was buried under 4 layers of falsehood. Plating that had to be carefully peeled back without alerting the Keth sensors. Patrick had discovered, to his obvious discomfort and eventual wonder, that the plating itself was part of the design. It was not mere camouflage but an active scattering layer that made the ship's energy signature look consistent with a standard propulsion system. From the outside, the Unbroken appeared to be putting out exactly what a 60-year-old vessel with a degraded reactor should put out. It appeared small and tired and harmless. On the bridge, Owen was managing the communications with remarkable composure for someone who now knew, courtesy of the relay network, that several alien commentators had begun treating the Unbroken's continued presence as a mildly touching but ultimately meaningless gesture of human pride. A mech cultural analyst had submitted a brief essay to a popular mech information feed about the psychological comfort that pre-collapse species sometimes drew from maintaining symbolic military presence in the face of inevitable transitions. The essay was politely written and completely wrong about everything. I did not tell Owen to stop monitoring the relay. I told him to keep notes. At hour 10, I called the full crew together in the central corridor, all 41 of them pressed into a space designed for 20, standing on equipment cases and leaning against bulkheads. I told them everything, not a version of it, not a carefully managed summary, everything the data card had revealed, everything Patrick had found, everything I now understood about what the Unbroken actually was. When I finished, nobody spoke for almost a minute. Then Callum Hart, the medic who had taught himself surgery from a tablet, said, "So we're not actually a deterrence vessel, we're a deterrence vessel." "There's a difference," I said. "One is about stopping a fight from starting," he said slowly. "The other is about ending one after it has." Yes. Diana Ford, the weapons officer, had been standing at the edge of the group, with her arms crossed in an expression that had been shifting through several phases since I started talking. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Commander, I need to tell you something. I said before, and I need to take it back. You said you didn't think our gun systems would matter. I was wrong about what our gun systems were." She paused. "I'm not wrong anymore. I told them what I needed from each of them. I told them the timing and the order of operations. I told them what the sealed orders specified about the firing sequence, the targeting priority, the engagement geometry. I told them that the whole galaxy was watching and that everything we did in the next several hours would be on permanent record in the relay archive. I also told them plainly that I was not ordering any of them to do this. The Unbroken had no mechanism for compulsion left. We were 41 people on a very old ship, and every one of them had joined this crew knowing the odds. Whatever they chose to do now, they chose freely. Nobody moved toward the exits. Owen Garrett said, speaking for everyone, "We've been following you for 3 years, Commander. This seems like a poor time to stop." I went back to the bridge and sat in the command chair. Outside, the KTH fleet waited. In 2 hours, the 12-hour window would close, and Vorak would expect an answer. I had spent the 10 hours since he granted the extension reading the sealed orders in full. They were thorough. Whoever had written them 60 years ago had understood that a ship like the Unbroken would only ever be deployed in the worst-case scenario, and they had planned accordingly. There were Notes in the margins handwritten. Scanned from the lead engineer who had overseen the original build. Her name was Dr. Frances Alberry. She had worked on the Unbroken for 9 years. She had written in very small handwriting at the bottom of the final page, "If you are reading this, the deterrence failed and it is now too late for deterrence use. What we built it to be enough." I read that sentence several times. Then I looked out at the 340 ships at the galaxy, watching from its comfortable distance at the quiet and beautiful darkness of the solar system that had been home to humanity for as long as the word humanity had existed. I said out loud to no one in particular, "All right, Francis, let's find out." I keyed the transmitter and opened the channel to the Keth fleet. "Admiral Vorek, this is Commander Voss. We have reviewed your terms. We have a response." The reply was almost instant. He had been expecting capitulation. He had been expecting to say something gracious about humanity's dignity and defeat. I could hear it in his translated voice. That particular quality of a person who has prepared their remarks and is ready to deliver them. "Go ahead, Commander." "We decline," I said. There was a pause on the relay. The alien commentary went momentarily quiet. Commander Voss Vorek said with the patience of someone explaining something to a child, "You are one vessel. We are. I know what you are." I said, "All hands. This is the commander. Execute." The Unbroken shuddered once. Long deep vibration that ran through every surface from hull to floor to the soles of my boots. It was the reactor, climbing from 12% to 100, and it felt like standing next to something that had been sleeping for 6 decades and was now finally fully awake. Every light on the bridge surge dimmed and then steadied at a brightness none of us had ever seen. Displays that had always shown partial data suddenly resolved into full clarity. Systems that had always run warm cooled instantly as they power distribution equalized. "Diana." Ford's voice came over the internal calm, very calm. "All accelerator tracks charged and ready. Drone network has confirmed positions on all 340 targets. Emitter array is live." I looked at the formation outside. They had not moved yet. They were processing our refusal, calculating, beginning to shift into attack posture with the slow confidence of a force that had never needed to hurry. "Diana," I said. "Fire." What happened next lasted 11 seconds. The accelerator tracks did not fire at individual ships. That was the elegance of it, the thing that Frances Alberry and her team had understood about large formations that no conventional weapons designer had properly addressed. You did not fight a fleet ship by ship. You fought the geometry of the fleet. You found the intervals between vessels, the shared propellant clouds, the overlapping energy wakes, and you introduced precisely calculated forces into those spaces that the fleet's own physics would amplify. The first salvo from the accelerator tracks hit 4 points in the formation simultaneously. The secondary effects began within 2 seconds. The energy emitter array fired once, a single pulse directed at the command cluster at the center of the formation, broad enough to affect 7 ships at once, precise enough to leave the vessels on either side untouched. The KE fleet, which had been a perfect military formation 30 seconds ago, was no longer a formation. 1/3 of 340 ships ceased to function as organized spacecraft in the span of time it takes To say the sentence, the relay was still. Broadcasting, every word, every sensor. Reading, every exterior camera feed was. Going out to 400 inhabited systems. I sat in the command chair and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. I had not won, not yet. What I had done was prove that this was a real fight, and that changes everything about how a fight proceeds. Vorek's channel opened without announcement, his voice translated flat and clean by the machine said 3 words. What was that? I answered honestly, that was the beginning. Outside, the surviving KE ships began to move, and I had not yet given Diana Ford the order to stop. The surviving ships broke pattern the moment their commanders understood what had happened to the first third of the fleet. There was no coordinated response. That was the first thing I noticed, and it told me something important about the KE command structure. Vorek had operated on the assumption that this engagement would require no real coordination because there would be no real resistance. His captains had been given no contingency protocols for a single human vessel that could do what the Unbroken had just done. Panic when it arrives in a military formation looks very different from the outside than it does from the inside. From the inside, each individual captain is making a rational decision based on the information available to them. From the outside, the result is a 200-ship formation attempting to scatter in 200 different directions simultaneously, which is not scattering at all. It is chaos wearing the mask of action. I watched the drone networks feed on my display, 400 tiny relay points, each one sending back a precise picture of what was happening, 15,000 km in every direction. The surviving Keth ships were bright signatures on a clean map, moving now, breaking from their elegant arc into something much less organized. Some were accelerating hard away from our position, some were moving toward each other, their captains converging on what they perceived as safety and numbers without coordinating. Who would do the converging? Diana said, "Hold." The word went out across the internal comm with enough weight that I heard it echo off the bulkheads. "Commander," Diana's voice carried a question but not an argument. "Hold. Fire full stop on all systems. Give me 2 minutes." I keyed the open channel to the relay network. I did not address Vorek, I addressed whoever was listening on the other end of that broadcast. Sarathi, the mech, the Pale Syndicate. Every species that had watched 3 years of blockade with comfortable neutrality and 11 seconds of actual combat with something that I suspected for the first time might be genuine alarm. This is Commander Aller Voss of the Earth Survey Vessel Unbroken. I said, I am addressing the full relay audience. What you are witnessing is not an escalation. It is a response. Humanity did not choose this confrontation. We did not pursue this war. We did not blockade an alien system, starve a civilian population of resources, and arrive with 340 warships to deliver terms of surrender. We answered one question that was asked of us, which was, are you still here? We are still here. We would very much like to remain here on our own, as we have always preferred. If anyone listening to this broadcast is in a position to discuss that preference, now would be an appropriate time. I closed the channel. Owen was looking at me with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Commander, the Sarathi channel is lighting up. They want a private line. Not yet. What are the KTH doing? The 217 remaining vessels are at various stages of dispersal. Some are clustering. Vorik flagship is holding position at roughly 14,000 km. No significant movement. He's watching. I said, yes, ma'am. Good, he should watch. I stood from the command chair and walked to the forward viewport. The solar system was very quiet out there. The pale arc of Saturn's rings was visible at this distance, catching the sun at an angle that made them look like a brushstroke someone had added to the darkness as an afterthought. I had grown up in a city on the English coast and had looked at the sky my entire childhood and wondered what it felt like. Up here, it did not feel the way I had imagined. It felt like responsibility that had no edges. I turned back to the bridge. Diana, I want targeted engagement on any K vessel that changes course toward Earth or toward our position. Not preemptive, reactive. If they move toward us, we respond. If they continue to disperse, we hold. Understood. Owen opened the channel to Vorik. The connection tone sounded once, twice, then his voice still translated. Still flat. Commander Voss, Admiral Voro, I want to talk to you about the names. A pause. I do not understand the names of the people we lost at Ceres. I said, I want to read them to you, all of them. I have the complete list in front of me, the full crew manifest of every human vessel destroyed in the Ceres engagement, every person listed as confirmed dead or unaccounted for. I want you to hear them before we continue. Another pause, longer this time. Commander, this is not, I know it is not standard. I said nothing about today is standard, but I have 400 inhabited systems listening to this relay, and I think before we discuss what happens next, they should all hear who made it necessary. I did not wait for his response. I began reading. List had 2,312 names on it. I read each one clearly, with the correct pronunciation where I knew it, with a respectful pause where I did not. I read the names of people I had known personally and people I had never met. I read the names of captains and technicians, navigators and medical staff, cargo specialists who had been drafted into military service when the fleets needed bodies. I read for a long time. Nobody on my bridge spoke. Relay stayed open. When I finished, the channel was very quiet. Vorik's voice, when it came, had a quality I had not heard from him before. The translation flattened the effect, but it could not entirely remove it. He said, what do you want, Commander Voss? I want your fleet to stand down. I want the blockade ended permanently. I want full resource corridor access restored to Earth in all human-occupied stations. I want a formal cessation of Keth Dominion territorial claims within our solar system. I paused, and I want you to understand that I am not asking for those things. I'm informing you that those are the terms by which this engagement concludes. There is a difference, a very long silence. Then, from the relay monitoring, Owen spoke softly. Commander, the Sarathi are calling again, and the mech channel just went active, and there's a third signal I don't have a classification for yet. They'll wait, I said. Let Vorik answer. The Admiral of the Keth Dominion 3rd Expansion Fleet, commanding 217 surviving vessels out of an original 340, took 45 seconds to respond. You have one ship, he said. The statement had lost whatever contempt it might have carried an hour ago. It was simply an observation now. Man making sure of the facts. I know, I said. Would you like me to demonstrate what that ship can do with the rest of your fleet? I let the question sit there. On the open relay, I let every observer, every diplomat, every analyst who had dismissed us, every species that had watched with comfortable certainty that this would be a brief ceremony before the main business of planetary incorporation, sit with that question and whatever answer their own experience suggested to them. Vorik said, no, then we understand each other. I leaned forward slightly. One more thing, Admiral, I want your fleet to begin withdrawal within the next 4 hours, not dispersal. Withdrawal back the way you came. I want every ship moving away from this solar system on a verifiable course, and if we comply, then you take your ships home and we go back to being the irrelevant species with the old ship that nobody needs to worry about. I let a beat pass, or we can test that theory. It's your decision. A pause, then 4 hours we will begin. I closed the channel. The bridge was very still. Owen had his hands flat on his console as though steadying himself. Priya was staring at her navigation display without appearing to see it. Patrick Lyle's voice came over the internal comm. From engineering, Commander, I heard the transmission. Should I begin powering down? Not yet, I said. Keep everything at full readiness until the last KET ship crosses the outer marker. Then we can sleep. I sat back down in the command chair and looked out at the solar system. The sun was smaller from here than it looked from the surface of Earth, but it was still bright enough to cast clean shadows across the instrument panels. Saturn's rings were still there. Everything was still there. Owen said very quietly, Commander, the Sarathi are requesting a formal channel. They want to offer something. I'm reading the header as a diplomatic acknowledgement of human sovereignty. Take the details. We'll respond when the K are gone. And the mech channel, same. He nodded and went back to work. The relay was still broadcasting. The galaxy was still watching, but the quality of that watching had changed in the last 2 hours in a way that was difficult to articulate but very easy to feel. It no longer felt like an audience watching a historical footnote. It felt like observers who had been standing very near something they did not fully understand and had taken one step back. I thought about a sentence from the sealed orders from Francis Albert's handwritten note at the bottom of the last page. We built it to be enough. I thought about what enough meant when the entire galaxy had decided you did not matter. I looked out at the stars and did not say anything. There was time for words later. Right now there was only the work of watching the Keth fleet begin slowly and without fanfare to turn around. Vorik's flagship moved last. I had expected that a man like him, commanding a fleet like that, would not be the first to withdraw. He would watch his ships go ahead of him and then follow at the end, so that if anyone was counting, and on the relay everyone was counting, it would be clear that he had not run. He had simply chosen to leave. I watched it on the drone network display. Ship after ship, the surviving KE vessels aligned themselves on outbound trajectories and accelerated away from the solar system. It took most of the 4-hour window. By the time the last standard vessel crossed the outer marker that I had specified, Vorok's flagship was the only KE ship remaining inside Earth's immediate neighborhood. It sat at 14,000 km for another 20 minutes just sitting there. I did not rush him. Then it turned and it went. I let out a breath that I had been holding, not continuously but in recurring installments for the better part of 6 hours. It came out steadier than I expected. Priya Akafer swiveled in her chair, looked at me and smiled. It was a small smile, tired and genuine and complicated, the kind that only appears on the face of someone who has been braced for the worst for long enough that the absence of it takes a moment to process. Owen Garrett had tears on his face. He was not trying to hide them. I did not comment on it. I felt that doing so would have been unkind. Patrick Lyle's voice came over the comm. All clear on the engineering side. Commander, fleet is beyond our effective engagement range. Recommend we begin a graduated power reduction to preserve reactor life. A pause. She ran beautifully, by the way. Every system. I've never seen anything like it. Thank her for me, I said. A brief silence, and then I already did. The next several hours were quiet in a way that had a texture to it, a density, as though the air itself had changed composition. My crew moved through their tasks with the measured, careful pace of people who have been running hard and are now learning to slow down without stopping entirely. There was a lot of documentation to complete. The drone network needed to be recalled and archived. Every system activation in the past 12 hours had to be logged in a format that command could eventually review whenever there was a command structure again to do the reviewing. I sat at the communications console and began drafting the formal relay response to the Sarathi. They had transmitted a clear and direct acknowledgement of human sovereignty, not a request, not a proposal, but a statement of fact on the public record. The Mech Confederacy had transmitted something similar within 40 minutes. By the time I had been sitting at the console for 2 hours, 12 separate galactic entities had gone on record. Some were large powers, some were small stations and independent settlements that had no particular influence over anyone, but had clearly decided they wanted to be documented on the right side of this particular moment. I read each one carefully. I drafted responses that were courteous and brief and did not carry either excessive gratitude or unnecessary assertion. We had not won a war. We had ended a particular confrontation in a particular way, and the arrangements that followed would be built on what we said and did in the hours right after. I had no desire to overreach. I had never had any desire to overreach. What I wanted was the same thing I had always wanted. The same thing every commander I had served under had wanted. The same thing I was increasingly convinced that most humans alive on Earth right now simply wanted: to be left alone to solve their own problems at their own pace without someone else deciding that their pace was insufficient and their problems were now someone else's opportunity. I wrote that actually in the formal response to the Sarathi. I wrote something very close to that, not aggressively, just plainly, here is who we are and here is what we would like, and we are capable of making our preferences known in ways you have recently observed, but we would greatly prefer not to. The Sarathi response came back in under an hour. Understood, terms accepted as stated. 12 words, that was all. Owen brought me something hot from the galley around hour 14. I'm not sure what it was. It tasted like coffee had been attempted, and a different outcome had arrived. I drank it anyway. Commander, he said, sitting on the edge of the console. He was not technically supposed to sit on. What happens now to the unbroken I mean to us, I consider the question properly which it deserved. I think we go home, I said, and then we have a very long conversation with whoever is left in the oversight structure about what to do with a ship that nobody was supposed to know this much about. Will they be upset? Almost certainly, I said. People in authority positions tend to be upset when they discover that a 60-year-old secret went public on the Galactic Relay Archive. I drank some more of the non-coffee, but they will be alive to be upset, which is better than the alternative. Owen nodded slowly. The Relay Archive, everything is in there. The whole thing, yes, every species with relay access saw it, yes, so there's no. He searched for the right phrase. Putting it back, no, I said there is not. The galaxy knows what the unbroken is now. That is actually fine with me. Francis Albury was worried that revealing this ship's capabilities would trigger a response we could not manage. And she was right, in a different era. But the situation has changed. I set down the cup. When you are the only species in a crowded room who has demonstrated that you can end a fight that badly if one starts, the incentive to start a fight is considerably reduced. Owen thought about that. Then he said, so by revealing it we actually become safer. That is the hope. I said, that is very much the hope. Callum Hart appeared at the end of the corridor, looking exhausted and quietly proud of something. He had spent the duration of the engagement in the medical bay, which had not been needed for casualties, but which he had kept fully prepared throughout, because Callum Hart prepared for things. He was that kind of person. He had become that kind of person because the situation had required it of him, which was true of most of us. Everyone is all right, he reported, which was his version of a status update. A few stress-related symptoms, nothing requiring intervention. Celia Marsh has not slept in 22 hours, but refuses to go off duty until the accelerator tracks are formally logged as secure, which Patrick says will be another hour. Tell her that is not a request, I said. Tell her the tracks will still be there after she sleeps. She knows that she's logging them anyway. I did not push it further. I understood the impulse. You do something enormous, and you need to close the loop on it properly. Document every step. Make sure the record is clean and complete before you let go. I had the same impulse. It was the reason I was still at the communications console when I should have been in my bunk. Diana Ford came to the bridge around hour 16 and sat in the chair beside mine without speaking. We had known each other for 2 years. She had told me once early on that she had taken the posting on the Unbroken because there was nowhere better to be offered, and she had stayed because she had run out of reasons to leave. She was the most technically precise person I had ever worked with, and one of the least sentimental. She sat beside me for about 5 minutes, watching the sensor feeds show an empty and quiet solar system. I want to say something, she said finally. All right. I spent 3 years thinking that when this moment came, whatever form it came in, I would feel afraid. I have been running low-level background fear for so long that I stopped noticing it. It was just the ambient condition of being on this ship. She looked at the viewport, and then today happened, and I was not afraid. I was the most focused I have ever been in my entire professional life. And I was not afraid, and I do not entirely understand why. What do you think it was? I asked. She considered. I think it was the ship, she said. I think it was knowing what she actually was, not what we thought she was, what she actually was. A pause. She was built to be enough, and she was, and there is something in that, something about not being surprised by your own adequacy. That removes the fear. I looked at her for a moment, then I looked back out at the stars. I want to put that in the report. I said, please don't. She said, command will already have enough to process. We sat together in companionable silence for a while after that. The solar system was very calm. The galactic relay continued to archive everything transmitted across its network, which meant that somewhere in a data structure larger than any individual mind could hold, the last 12 hours were already permanent. What had happened here was already history. We were already in the middle of the aftermath. At hour 18, I asked Owen to gather the crew one more time. They came to the central corridor, all 41 of them. Slower now, heavier with tiredness, but present. They always came when I asked. They had always come. I stood in front of them, and I did not have a speech prepared. I was not a person who prepared speeches. I said what was true. We were given a ship that nobody expected to matter. I said we were given a mission that nobody expected to succeed. We were given 12 hours to do something that the entire galaxy decided was impossible before we started, and we did it because it needed to be done, and we were the ones who were there. I looked at each of them one by one, taking my time. I want to say each of your names, not as a list, as a record. And I did. I said every name with a sentence about what each person had done during the engagement. Owen, who had managed communications with precise clarity while the fate of the species moved through his console. Priya, who had maintained navigation under conditions that made navigation irrelevant and had done so without being asked to stop. Patrick, who had brought a 60-year-old reactor to full power in 9 hours and had spoken to it gently throughout. Celia, who had stood at the accelerator track controls and trusted mathematics she had never tested before and had been correct. Callum, who had kept every person on the ship in functional physical condition across 3 years of near impossible circumstances. Diana, who had fired when I said fire and held when I said hold, and had not once asked me whether I was sure. I said all 41 names. I said a true thing about each one. When I was done, nobody applauded. That was right. This was not a moment for applause. This was a moment for recognition, which is a quieter and more durable thing. Celia Marsh, standing in the back with her eyes red from exhaustion and something else, said, "What do we do now?" "Commander, we go home." I said, "We document everything. We file everything. We let the people whose job it is to negotiate, and we go home." And then I thought about Francis Albury, writing in very small handwriting at the bottom of a page that she hoped no one would ever read. I thought about a man named Leonard Hale pressing a data card into my hand on a shuttle dock and saying something in 7 words that took me 3 years to understand. And then I said, "We rest. We have earned it." I went back to the command chair one last time before turning the bridge over to the night watch, a concept that retained its name on a ship that operated in perpetual artificial day, because humans like to keep their rhythms even in space. I sat and I looked out at the solar system, at the sun and the planets and the particular darkness between them that was ours. And I thought about what it meant to still be here. It meant everything. It also meant nothing complicated. We were still here. The galaxy had decided we were not a factor, and we had declined to agree with that assessment, and now we were still here. The terms were not perfect. The work was not finished. Nothing was resolved in the permanent way that people sometimes imagine resolutions to be. The K would take their defeat and process it and eventually become something new in relation to humanity. Not a friend probably, but something less certain than an enemy, which was progress by the standards available to us. The other powers who had watched would update their calculations about what a human vessel was capable of, and that updating process would be uncomfortable for everyone, including us. We would have conversations we did not want to have with people we did not entirely trust about things that mattered too much to handle carelessly. All of that was coming, but right now, in this moment, the solar system was quiet and the unbroken was whole, and 41 people who had every reason to give up had simply and completely refused to. I keyed the ship's log and began recording. Commander log, ESV unbroken. The date is current, the ship is intact, and the crew is alive. There is a lot to document, and I will get to all of it. But I want to start with the observation that this ship was written off before it was finished, and written off again when it was decommissioned, and written off again when every other human vessel was lost, and again when the K fleet arrived and the galaxy decided to broadcast our irrelevance to 400 inhabited systems. I paused. There is a lesson in that, about the difference between what a thing appears to be and what it actually is, about what gets dismissed because it looks old or slow or small or tired, about what gets called no factor by people who have not yet learned what the factors actually are. Another pause. I do not know if anyone will listen to this log. I do not know what comes next, for us or for Earth or for the agreements that will be negotiated in the weeks ahead. I do not know if the galaxy has genuinely changed its assessment of humanity, or if it has simply revised the risk calculation, which is not the same thing. What I know is this: they mocked the last ship. Then the last ship showed them the difference between a vessel that cannot fight and a vessel that has chosen not to fight yet. That difference turned out to matter a great deal. I hope they remember it. I closed the log. Outside, the stars held their positions without any concern for what had just happened. They had been there before us and would be there long after. In between, for this particular stretch of time in this particular corner of the galaxy, we had been here too. We had endured something that was not supposed to be survivable in a ship that was not supposed to still be flying, with a crew that was not supposed to matter. We had mattered. We were still here. That in the end was